Food remembers what nations tried to forget. Long before America and China was spoken of as rivals, long before flags and ideologies hardened, food was already moving between them quietly, imperfectly, and without permission. Not as diplomacy, not as exchange, but as survival. In the mid-1800s, when Chinese migrants first arrived in large numbers on American soil, they did not come carrying a cuisine meant to impress. They came carrying memory, rice, dried fish, fermented sauces, cooking habits shaped by scarcity, region, and tradition. Food was not a performance. It was how you stayed alive when everything familiar had been stripped away. America, at the same time, was expanding violently westward. The country was hungry in a different way, hungry for labor, hungry for land, hungry for growth. Chinese workers were welcomed for what their bodies could provide and rejected for everything else they were. Food became the first negotiation point between these worlds. Chinese migrants cooked for themselves at first, using ingredients they could find or substitute. They adapted quietly. Pork replaced duck. Local greens replaced familiar vegetables. Soy sauce stretched further than it should have. Flavor adjusted not to taste, but to availability. But when Chinese workers began cooking for Americans, everything changed. American palates were unfamiliar with Chinese regional cuisines. The food was strange, foreign, unsettling. Strong smells, textures that didn't match expectations. Dishes that didn't center meat in the way Americans were used to. To survive economically, Chinese cooks began modifying their food again, this time intentionally for an outside audience. Sauces became thicker, sweetness increased, dishes were simplified, presentation shifted, familiar ingredients were emphasized. The result was not deception. It was translation under pressure. This was not cultural exchange between equals. It was adaptation under exclusion. As anti-Chinese sentiment intensified in the late 1800s, food took on a new role. Chinese people were portrayed as unclean, dangerous, and alien. Their food was described the same way. Political cartoons mocked Chinese kitchens. Newspapers accused Chinese restaurants of serving rats, dogs, anything but real food. Eating Chinese food became an act of curiosity and defiance for some Americans, and an act of necessity for Chinese immigrants who had few other economic options left. When the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882, it froze Chinese communities in time. Immigration was cut off. Families were separated. Restaurants became one of the only viable businesses Chinese men could legally operate. Food was no longer just livelihood. It was containment. Chinese restaurants multiplied across American cities, not because Chinese culture was being embraced, but because it was being boxed into something manageable. A place where Chinese presence could be tolerated, inside kitchens, behind counters, serving food adjusted to American taste. This is where American Chinese food truly begins. Dishes like Chop Suey did not come from ancient China. They came from this moment of pressure. Chop Suey was flexible, adaptable, cheap, and endlessly customizable. It could use scraps. It could feed many. It could taste familiar enough to Americans while still feeling exotic. It was not fake food. It was survival food. By the early 20th century, Chinese restaurants had spread across the United States. They were everywhere, in cities that had no Chinatown, in towns that had never seen a Chinese immigrant before. For many Americans, these restaurants became their only point of contact with China. What they were eating was not China. It was America's version of it. And that mattered. Food shapes imagination. When Americans thought of China, they thought of chop suey houses, lanterns, pagodas painted on menus, sweet sauces, and cheap meals. China became something consumable, simplified, and safely distant. Meanwhile, China itself was changing dramatically. The collapse of the Qing dynasty, warlord conflicts, Japanese invasion, civil war, all of this reshaped Chinese food culture in ways Americans never saw. Hunger, displacement, and survival stripped food down to its essentials. Regional cuisines fractured and reformed under pressure. By the time the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, the food cultures of America and China had already diverged completely. And then the Cold War sealed the split. China closed itself off from the West, politically and culturally. America reimagined China as an ideological enemy. The flow of people, ideas, and food stopped almost entirely. But American Chinese food didn't stop. It fossilized. Recipes passed from cook to cook, unchanged by developments in China itself. Menus standardized. Dishes became codified. What had once been adaptation hardened into tradition, but a tradition that existed only in America. By the 1950s and 60s, American Chinese food was no longer pretending to represent China. It had become its own cuisine, even if few were willing to say that out loud. General Tso's chicken, egg Foo Young, Crab Rangoon, sweet and sour everything. These dishes told Americans a comforting story. China was foreign, but friendly, exotic, but predictable, different, but safely edible. Behind the scenes, Chinese restaurateurs continued to live with contradiction. They were asked to represent authenticity while being punished economically for doing so. They were expected to preserve tradition while constantly adapting to demand. Food was the only language they were allowed to speak publicly. Meanwhile, actual China was experiencing some of the most radical food transformations in human history. Collectivization restructured agriculture. Rationing reshaped diets. Famine erased millions of lives and permanently altered how food was valued. Cooking became simpler not by choice, but necessity. Waste became unthinkable. Flavor became secondary to calories. This reality never reached American plates. Instead, Americans ate a fantasy of abundance and comfort while China endured scarcity and ideological control over eating itself. Two food histories, one name. By the 1970s, cracks began to appear. As diplomatic relations slowly thawed, curiosity followed. Travelers returned with stories of dishes Americans had never heard of. Food writers began questioning authenticity. Immigrants from new regions of China brought unfamiliar flavors with them. For the first time in decades, American diners were confronted with a possibility they had avoided: Chinese food was not what they thought it was. This caused tension. Some diners rejected the unfamiliar. Others embraced it as discovery. Restaurants adapted again, splitting menus, signaling spice levels, offering coded language for those in the know. Authenticity became a battleground, not because food had changed, but because power had. At the same time, globalization accelerated everything. China reopened to the world. Markets returned. Restaurants flourished. Regional cuisines reasserted themselves with pride. Food became expressive again, a symbol of recovery and identity. America, meanwhile, exported not just its food, but its food systems. Fast food chains entered China aggressively. Fried chicken, burgers, soft drinks, but adapted carefully. Menus localized. Spices adjusted. Rice replaced bread where necessary. China did not resist this. It studied it. Standardization, supply chains, scale. The same logic that once shaped American Chinese food now flowed in reverse. Food became infrastructure. By the early 21st century, the relationship between America and China could no longer be understood through taste alone. It had to be understood through production, logistics, labor, and power. China became central to global food supply chains. America became dependent on systems it no longer fully controlled. And yet, the story people told themselves remained simple. America believed it had invented modern food culture. China was catching up. China believed it was reclaiming tradition while modernizing. Both narratives were incomplete. Food had always been the mirror. What people ate revealed what they feared, what they valued, and what they were willing to compromise. And once again, tension rose. Trade disputes turned agricultural. Tariffs hit farmers before diplomats. Restaurants felt politics instantly. Supply chains became weapons. Food, once again, became political, but this time on a global scale. And yet, People kept eating. They ordered takeout. They cooked family recipes. They argued about authenticity online while ignoring the history that created the divide in the first place. American Chinese food was dismissed as fake. Modern Chinese food was framed as rediscovered. Neither label told the full truth. Both were products of pressure. Both were shaped by exclusion, adaptation, and power. And the story was far from over. By the time globalization fully accelerated in the 1990s and early 2000s, food was no longer just cultural exchange between America and China. It was infrastructure. It was leverage. It was dependency disguised as convenience. American grocery stores filled with products that quietly traced back to Chinese manufacturing. Packaging, processing equipment, frozen foods, ingredients no longer grown locally. Even when the food itself was not Chinese, the systems that made it affordable often were. At the same time, China's internal food system transformed at unprecedented speed. Urbanization pulled millions away from agriculture. Diets shifted toward meat, dairy, sugar, and oil. Traditional plant-forward eating patterns gave way to aspirational consumption. Food was no longer just nourishment. It was status. This shift required scale. China began importing massive amounts of soybeans, grain, and feed. Much of it came from the United States. American farmers, once insulated by domestic markets, found themselves tied directly to Chinese demand. When relations were smooth, profits flowed. When relations strained, livelihoods collapsed. Food had become diplomacy without speeches. Yet neither population fully understood how dependent they had become on one another. Because food still appeared simple on the surface. A meal, a restaurant, a grocery shelf. What remained invisible were the invisible hands shaping what was available, affordable, and normalized. In America, the conversation around Chinese food entered a new phase. Authenticity became currency. Diners sought real experiences. Social media rewarded discovery. Regional cuisines were labeled, ranked, and reviewed. But authenticity often ignored history. American Chinese food was mocked as inauthentic without acknowledging why it existed. It was judged by standards never applied to other immigrant cuisines shaped by adaptation. Pizza was not accused of betraying Italy. Tacos were not dismissed for changing north of the border. Chinese food carried the burden of geopolitics. Every conversation about taste became a conversation about legitimacy. Who had the authority to define what Chinese food was allowed to be? Who benefited when one version was elevated and another erased? At the same time, China experienced its own food identity crisis. Rapid modernization fractured generational memory. Older cooking practices faded. Younger consumers embraced novelty. Western food signaled modern life, while traditional food was sometimes framed as backward, even as the state promoted heritage selectively. Food became narrative. National pride wrapped itself around dishes. Culinary traditions were mobilized as cultural soft power. Cooking shows, food festivals, and tourism campaigns presented a unified image that often smoothed over regional, class, and historical complexity. In both countries, food was being curated. Then politics hardened again. Trade wars turned food into collateral. Tariffs raised prices. Farmers protested. Consumers felt disruption. Media framed it as conflict between nations, but the pressure landed on individuals. Chinese consumers worried about safety, supply, and price. American farmers worried about survival. Restaurants navigated rising costs silently. Once again, food exposed the cost of abstraction. When tensions escalated further, rhetoric shifted toward suspicion. Food safety became weaponized. Ingredients were questioned. Origins scrutinized. Cultural fear resurfaced under the language of protection. History echoed loudly. The same accusations once used to demonize Chinese food in the 19th century reappeared, updated for a modern audience. Contamination, deception, threat. Food became a proxy for distrust. And yet, everyday behavior told a different story. Americans continued to eat Chinese food in massive quantities. Chinese consumers continued to embrace global flavors. The table contradicted the headline. Because food does something politics struggles to do. It reveals contradiction. People crave connection even while fearing it. They want comfort without consequence. Familiarity without dependence. This tension defines the modern America-China food relationship. Neither side fully controls the system anymore. Supply chains are too intertwined. Taste has globalized beyond borders. A dish invented under exclusion now circulates freely online. A recipe once localized now trends worldwide. Food resists ownership. Even attempts to reclaim purity fail. Tradition cannot be frozen. It moves with people, pressure, and possibility. American Chinese food continues to evolve. Some restaurants reclaim it proudly as its own cuisine. Others reinterpret it consciously. Some preserve it unchanged, honoring the history embedded in its flavors. Modern Chinese food continues to diversify. Regional cuisines assert themselves globally. Diaspora cooks bridge worlds, creating food that refuses to choose sides. These developments are not signs of confusion. They are signs of survival. Because food has never belonged to nations the way borders suggest. It belongs to people navigating systems larger than themselves. The story of America versus China told through food is not about who won or who copied whom. It is about how power reshapes culture, and how culture quietly pushes back. Every adaptation carries memory. Every recipe carries compromise. Every dish is a record of choices made under constraint. When people argue about what Chinese food really is, they are often arguing about something else entirely. Belonging, control, identity, fear of dilution, fear of loss. Food absorbs those anxieties without speaking back. But history does speak. It tells us that cuisines born under pressure do not disappear when pressure lifts. They persist. They adapt again. They become archives. American Chinese food is an archive of exclusion, creativity, and resilience. Modern Chinese food is an archive of recovery, ambition, and negotiation with the world. Neither invalidates the other. Together, they tell a fuller story of two nations bound together not by ideology, but by appetite. As the future unfolds, new pressures will reshape this relationship again. Climate change will alter crops. Technology will redefine production. Nationalism will strain cooperation. Automation will change labor. Scarcity will return in new forms. Food will register these shifts first. You will see it in prices, in menus, in shortages, in trends framed as choice but driven by constraint. And people will argue about taste, unaware that they are tasting geopolitics. The lesson buried in this history is simple, but uncomfortable. You cannot separate food from power. You cannot separate taste from history. And you cannot understand America and China without understanding what they feed their people, and why. Because long after speeches fade, recipes remain. Long after borders shift, habits endure. And long after rivalries end, people will still sit at tables shaped by decisions they never made, eating stories they were never told.